Hello, guys. The long and uneventful history of the world begins in a time so distant and so immeasurably far back that even imagining it requires patience. In this very early stage, the Earth was simply a place of slow cooling, slow shifting, and slow development. Mountains rose so gradually that no living creature could notice the change. Oceans expanded and contracted over long periods. The land masses drifted at a pace almost imperceptible to the eye, moving only a few centimeters over an entire human lifetime. In these slow ages, nothing resembled the modern world. There were no cities, no tools, no languages that we would understand. Only long stretches of time filled with quiet geological activity. Volcanoes erupted occasionally, but even those eruptions, when viewed against millions of years, seemed like small passing events. The Earth simply continued its slow transformation, preparing the ground for the eventual arrival of life. After many millions of years, life began in the oceans, not in sudden bursts, but in extremely slow waves of evolution. Tiny organisms floated in the water, dividing and multiplying in rhythms that stretched across eras. It took countless generations for these simple organisms to develop new forms. They did not rush. Their changes happened one small mutation at a time, spreading quietly through their descendants. Slowly, some developed the ability to move. Some developed the ability to sense their surroundings. Over unimaginable periods, life spread across the world's waters. Eventually, plants appeared, first in the oceans and later on land. These early plants grew in simple, repetitive cycles, often remaining unchanged for vast stretches of time. Animals later followed. Small creatures crawled along the seafloor before gradually developing structures that allowed them to swim or walk. The first creatures to move onto land did so not with purpose or planning, but through slow adaptation shaped by countless generations. As forests grew, as climates shifted, different forms of life continued to evolve, always gradually, always through slow processes of change. The age of the dinosaurs came and went. Even the extinction of these great creatures, while sudden in geological terms, unfolded over long stretches when viewed from the perspective of daily life. New species rose slowly to fill the empty ecological spaces. Each adaptation and transformation took thousands or millions of years.
Throughout the 20th century, the pace of change increased, yet history still unfolded step by step. Airplanes improved steadily through engineering refinements. Automobiles became common after decades of manufacturing developments. Electricity spread through cities and towns, one neighborhood at a time. Even major events, such as world conflicts or economic shifts, were the products of long-term pressures building gradually beneath the surface of society. As modern technologies emerged, computers, satellites, the internet, they too evolved through long periods of experimentation and steady growth. Early computers were large and slow, requiring entire rooms for operation. Over years, they became smaller and more efficient. Networks formed between institutions and later between households, connecting people across distances. These advances changed communication, information, and daily routines, but they did so through repeated cycles of invention, testing, and adoption. Today, the world continues to move through time in the same patient way it always has. Cultures adapt slowly. Innovations spread gradually. Communities shift their habits over years, not moments. The story of the world remains a long sequence of steady transformations, shaped by billions of small decisions made by countless individuals. Each day contributes quietly to the larger pattern of history, just as it did in ancient times. And so, from the earliest days of the Earth to the present age, the history of humanity can be seen as a continuous, unhurried journey. Mountains rose slowly. Civilizations grew gradually. Knowledge expanded patiently. Technology advanced step by step. The world changed through calm processes that stretched across generations. This long, measured movement continues into the future, carrying humanity forward in the same slow, steady rhythm that has defined the entire story of our existence.
Gradually, a major shift began with the rise of industry. The Industrial Revolution was significant, but even it did not occur overnight. Early machines were simple and required constant supervision. Factories developed slowly as more inventions appeared, one after another, each improving production through small but meaningful steps. Workers spent long hours performing repetitive tasks, while engineers refined designs through trial and error. Cities grew as people moved to find work, and this growth took decades. Streets were planned, buildings constructed, and neighborhoods formed through gradual expansion. Transport improved with the invention of steam engines, but railways took years to build. Tracks had to be laid one section at a time. Tunnels had to be carved through mountains, and bridges constructed over rivers. Trains traveled at steady speeds across continents, changing trade and travel patterns through predictable schedules. The world became somewhat more connected, but the transformation remained slow and methodical, shaped by countless hours of labor and planning. Communication advanced as well. The telegraph and telephone introduced faster forms of messaging, but even these technologies spread gradually. Wires had to be installed across long distances, poles erected, and local systems organized. People adopted these new tools cautiously, learning how to use them over time. Newspapers grew in popularity, but they required printing presses, distribution routes, and daily routines to operate effectively.
As the slow movement of history continued, the world gradually approached a period when exploration, trade, and cultural exchange would reshape societies. These changes, however, did not arrive quickly. They came through steady expansions of curiosity, repeated voyages, and long processes of adaptation. European sailors, after many years of studying coastlines and winds, began traveling farther into the oceans. Early ships moved at calm, predictable speeds, powered only by wind and careful navigation. Voyages across the seas took months, and each journey required patience. The knowledge gained from these travels spread slowly through maps copied by hand and stories told quietly in ports and marketplaces. As contact between distant regions increased, ideas and goods circulated more widely. But even these exchanges happened in gradual waves. Spices from Asia moved step by step through trade networks. Textiles from India reached Europe only after passing through many hands. Precious metals from the Americas traveled across long, measured routes before reaching European cities. The movements of people, traders, explorers, scholars, continued at a steady pace, shaping societies without dramatic speed. Cultures influenced one another gently through slow adoption of food, fabrics, technologies, and beliefs. In the centuries that followed, scientific thinking grew through small observations and careful experiments. Scholars studied the natural world by spending long hours observing stars, plants, minerals, and human behavior. Their discoveries did not spread instantly. Books had to be printed, shipped, stored, and read, and each of these steps required time. Universities developed curricula slowly, adjusting to new ideas only after years of discussion. Inventions such as the telescope and microscope changed how people understood the world, yet even these tools took decades to become widely used. Knowledge expanded through patient study, thoughtful debate, and the steady accumulation of information. Meanwhile, societies around the world continued to evolve in their own slow rhythms. In Africa, new kingdoms emerged as trade patterns shifted. In Asia, dynasties rose and declined through long cycles of administration, agriculture, and cultural development. In the Americas, societies reorganized after new contacts, establishing patterns that blended older traditions with newer influences. Across all these regions, daily life remained grounded in familiar routines. People farmed, cooked, raised children, and built communities at measured, predictable speeds.
As the Roman Empire expanded, it absorbed various cultures and traditions, blending them into a broader network of trade and governance. But the expansion did not happen quickly. It took centuries to reach its height, with each territory requiring careful administration and long periods of adjustment. When Rome eventually declined, the process was not sudden. The empire weakened slowly, affected by economic struggles, political disputes, and pressures from outside groups. Over time, cities shrank, trade diminished, and the once busy roads grew quiet. The fall of Rome marked the beginning of a long period that came to be known as the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, much of Europe entered an era of slow progress. Castles were built on hilltops, but each castle took decades to complete. Stone by stone, workers constructed walls, towers, and gates, often spending their entire lives on a single structure. Villagers lived around these castles, tending fields and caring for livestock. The rhythm of life followed the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, gathering firewood before winter. Knowledge was preserved in monasteries, where monks copied manuscripts in quiet rooms. Each page took hours of careful effort, and copying an entire book could take months or even years. This slow process helped preserve ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. In other parts of the world, similar patterns unfolded. In Africa, kingdoms such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai thrived through steady trade across the Sahara Desert. Caravans of camels moved at deliberate speeds, carrying salt, gold, and other goods. Travel across the desert took weeks, with stops at oases providing brief periods of rest. The spread of culture and religion across this region occurred gradually, carried by traders and travelers who repeated their journeys year after year. In Asia, powerful empires rose slowly. The Silk Road connected China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The journey along this route was long and difficult. Merchants traveled in groups, moving steadily across mountains and deserts. Goods such as silk, spices, and precious stones were exchanged slowly along the way. The influence of these goods spread gradually into distant societies. Meanwhile, in Japan, small clans developed systems of governance that slowly evolved into a samurai-led order. Poetry, art, and craftsmanship became refined through patient practice rather than sudden innovation. In the Americas, civilizations developed independently. The Maya built large stone temples through the slow accumulation of architectural knowledge. Their calendar systems and writing methods evolved over centuries. The Aztecs and Inca, too, formed large societies whose structures grew gradually over long periods. Farming on terraces, building road networks, and organizing cities required repeated efforts by countless workers. Through all these regions, one clear pattern shaped human history: slow and steady change. Societies rarely transformed overnight.
Instead, they shifted gradually through countless small actions repeated across generations. Buildings rose brick by brick, knowledge spread page by page, and cultures evolved through simple, everyday decisions made by ordinary people. This extended, unhurried movement of history continued for centuries more, leading the world slowly toward the age of exploration, new trade routes, and eventually the beginnings of industry.
Farther east, in ancient China, small kingdoms formed and dissolved over long periods. Communities along the Yellow River developed farming methods to manage the unpredictable floods. Over centuries, these methods improved. People built dikes and canals, strengthening them slowly year after year. The rise of dynasties marked changes in leadership, but the everyday life of villagers remained largely the same. They planted millet in the spring, harvested in the fall, collected firewood, and prepared simple meals. Tools made of bronze began to appear, but their adoption was gradual, spreading from one region to another over many years. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks developed city-states that took shape through slow political and cultural evolution. Citizens gathered in open squares to discuss local matters, but these discussions unfolded in measured tones, often repeating the same issues for decades. Philosophers walked through shaded pathways, thinking deeply about the nature of life and knowledge. Their ideas, written down slowly and carefully, spread gradually through manuscripts copied by hand. As Greece expanded its reach, it did so by establishing colonies one by one, each requiring time to grow from a small settlement into a more stable community. Rome, which would later dominate much of the Western world, began as a simple village. Over centuries, it transformed into a republic and then an empire. Roads were constructed, but each road took years of work by teams of soldiers and laborers. These roads stretched across mountains and plains, allowing for slow movement of goods and people. Roman laws were written and rewritten, reflecting gradual changes in society. Daily life remained slow and structured. Families ate meals at predictable times. Shops opened in regular patterns, and public baths followed steady routines. Soldiers trained repeatedly in disciplined formations, practicing maneuvers that had been passed down through many generations.
Part 2. As the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other river valleys continued to grow, their daily routines remained remarkably steady. Most people still lived simple lives, waking with the sun and working in quiet, repetitive patterns. Farmers tended fields of barley and wheat, often using the same tools for many generations. They dug canals to guide water through their crops, maintaining these channels year after year in slow, methodical rhythms. In villages, potters shaped clay vessels on slow-turning wheels, creating containers that changed only slightly in design over long periods. Weavers spun thread and produced cloth using techniques passed down steadily through families. Life remained anchored in familiar cycles, with little variation from one season to the next. As towns became cities, rulers emerged, not suddenly, but gradually, as certain families gained influence over long stretches of time. Temples were built, not for decoration, but to represent the steady presence of religion in daily life. Priests recorded offerings on clay tablets, marking each entry with care and patience. Over the centuries, writing continued to evolve, but most of what was recorded remained simple lists, inventories, and basic information. The slow spread of literacy meant that only a few members of society could read or write. Meanwhile, in the region of the Indus Valley, another civilization developed with careful planning. Streets were laid out in straight lines, drains were constructed under the roads,
and homes were built with standardized bricks. These changes did not occur in a burst of innovation, but over many generations of gradual improvement. The people lived quietly, trading goods through long-distance routes that connected them with distant lands. Each journey took weeks or months, with traders carrying products like beads, pottery, and grain. The pace of this trade remained slow and predictable.
In some regions, these villages grew into towns. In Mesopotamia, the fertile land between two rivers supported the gradual rise of early city-states. People discovered ways to record information using simple marks on clay tablets. These marks were first used to track supplies, but eventually became more complex, evolving into early forms of writing. This development took centuries, with each symbol slowly becoming more standardized. Farther west, along the Nile River, the early communities of Egypt developed a steady pattern of life, shaped by the river's annual flooding. The rhythm of planting and harvesting followed the river's predictable cycle. Over centuries, these communities built more organized structures, eventually forming a centralized society. The construction of pyramids, temples, and monuments required decades of patient labor. Workers moved heavy stones in repetitive motions, day after day, under the supervision of planners who also worked through slow, methodical processes. And so the long history of humanity continued, always shaped by slow change, quiet growth, and steady patterns. In some regions, these villages grew into towns. In Mesopotamia, the fertile land between two rivers supported the gradual rise of early city-states. People discovered ways to record information using simple marks on clay tablets. These marks were first used to track supplies, but eventually became more complex, evolving into early forms of writing. This development took centuries, with each symbol slowly becoming more standardized. Farther west, along the Nile River, the early communities of Egypt developed a steady pattern of life, shaped by the river's annual flooding. The rhythm of planting and harvesting followed the river's predictable cycle. Over centuries, these communities built more organized structures, eventually forming a centralized society. The construction of pyramids, temples, and monuments required decades of patient labor. Workers moved heavy stones in repetitive motions, day after day, under the supervision of planners who also worked through slow, methodical processes. And so the long history of humanity continued, always shaped by slow change, quiet growth, and steady patterns.
Eventually, in one small branch of evolution, early primates appeared. They lived in forests, moving from tree to tree, living simple lives without any understanding of the future. Over long periods, they developed better coordination, better eyesight, and more complex social behavior. Some of these primates descended from the trees and began walking upright. This shift did not happen in a moment, but in extremely gradual stages, with small changes in posture strengthening over countless generations. These early humans wandered through open landscapes, learning slowly how to survive. They created simple tools by striking stones together, and even this process of improvement took thousands of years. For a long time, these tools changed very little. People lived by gathering plants and hunting animals, repeating the same routines day after day, year after year. Eventually, humans learned to control fire. But even this development took centuries. The earliest fires may have been accidental, caused by lightning strikes. Over time, early humans learned to maintain flames, using them for warmth, protection, and cooking. The use of fire spread gradually across communities, and the lifestyle of early humans became slightly more predictable. Still, most of their days were filled with basic tasks, walking long distances, searching for food, and resting. Thousands of years passed with almost no noticeable change. As the world warmed after long ice ages, humans began experimenting with planting seeds. No one invented farming in a single moment. Instead, people slowly observed how plants grew, how seasons changed, and how food sources could be managed. These small observations became habits, and these habits eventually formed the first farming practices. Farming allowed people to settle in one place for longer periods. Early villages grew slowly, often over centuries. Simple shelters were built, expanded, repaired, and rebuilt. Families lived in these villages generation after generation, repeating familiar routines involving planting, harvesting, storing food, and caring for animals.